The mahogany conference table gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the Century Properties boardroom. 23 years I'd been away from this moment. 23 years since Marcus Blackwood threw my belongings onto the rain-soaked pavement like garbage. Now here he sat, fidgeting with his gold-plated pen, completely unaware that the woman across from him was the same broken veteran he'd crushed under his designer Italian loafers all those years ago. His expensive suit couldn't hide the nervous sweat beading on his forehead as he waited to meet his new property manager, the person who would now control every aspect of his real estate empire. What he didn't know was that Justice had been patient, methodical, and it was about to speak his language, the only language men like Marcus Blackwood understood: power. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me as I straightened the nameplate on the table. Elena Rodriguez, Senior Property Manager, Apex Real Estate Solutions. The same hands that had once scrambled to gather my scattered possessions from the sidewalk now held the keys to every property Marcus owned in the tri-state area. 23 years of climbing, fighting, and proving myself had led to this single moment of reckoning. Marcus cleared his throat, glancing at his Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. He'd always been impatient, always believed his time was more valuable than everyone else's. I remembered that from before, when I'd knocked on his office door with trembling hands, begging for just 2 more weeks to catch up on rent. Back then, I was Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, recently discharged, struggling with injuries both visible and invisible, trying to rebuild a life that military service had prepared me for everything except civilian reality. Ms. Rodriguez should be here any moment, his assistant had told him, though I'd been sitting in the lobby for 20 minutes, watching him through the glass walls, studying the man who'd haunted my nightmares for over 2 decades. He looked older now, softer around the edges, his hair silver where it used to be that rich brown I remembered. But his eyes held the same cold calculation, the same dismissive arrogance that had made him capable of throwing a wounded veteran onto the street without a second thought. The door opened and his assistant stepped in. "Mr. Blackwood, your new property manager is here." She stepped aside and I entered the room with measured steps, my heels clicking against the polished floor like a countdown. Marcus looked up from his phone, his practiced smile freezing as our eyes met across the table. For just a moment I saw recognition flicker behind his expression, quickly replaced by confusion, then dismissal. After all, what were the chances that the broken woman he'd destroyed would return as his boss? "Mr. Blackwood," I said, extending my hand across the table. My voice was steady, professional, giving nothing away. "Elena Rodriguez, I'm excited to begin managing your portfolio." His handshake was firm, his palm slightly damp, and I felt the gold signet ring on his pinky, the same one he'd worn when he signed my eviction papers. He was studying my face now, something nagging at him, but 23 years had changed me. The frightened, desperate woman he'd known was gone, replaced by someone who'd earned every stripe, every promotion, every victory through sheer will and determination. "Have we met before?" he asked, settling back into his leather chair. "You seem familiar." I allowed myself a small smile, the kind that could be interpreted as politeness or something far more dangerous. "I have one of those faces," I replied, opening my briefcase and spreading documents across the table. "Shall we discuss your properties?" But I could see it in his eyes, the wheels turning, trying to place me. Marcus Blackwood had built his fortune on reading people, on knowing who posed a threat and who could be dismissed. Right. Now, I was an enigma, and that made him uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort was exactly what I wanted him to feel, just a taste of what was coming. The conference room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. 23 floors below, people went about their daily lives, unaware that in this sterile corporate environment, the past was finally catching up with the present. I'd spent years imagining this moment, planning for it, working toward it with the same tactical precision the military had taught me. Every night shift I'd worked, every college course I'd taken, every certification I'd earned, every connection I'd made in the real estate industry, had been building to this. Marcus was flipping through the first set of documents I'd handed him, his brow furrowed in concentration. They were standard property management contracts, nothing unusual, but I could see his discomfort growing. He was a man who liked to be in control, who thrived on being the smartest person in the room, and right now he felt off balance. The woman sitting across from him radiated confidence and competence, but there was something else, something he couldn't quite identify. "Your portfolio is impressive," I said, my voice cutting through his thoughts. 47 residential properties, 12 commercial buildings, and 3 mixed-use developments. Combined value of approximately $1.8 billion. I paused, letting the numbers sink in. That's a lot of responsibility. A lot of trust. The emphasis on the word trust was subtle, but I saw him register it. Marcus had built his empire on the backs of people he deemed expendable, charging exorbitant rents while providing minimal maintenance, evicting tenants for the slightest infractions, always prioritizing profit over people. "Yes, well," he said, loosening his tie slightly, "that's why we need someone competent to oversee operations. Your credentials are impressive, Ms. Rodriguez. Harvard Business School, 15 years with Morrison & Associates, outstanding references." He was reciting my resume, trying to regain his footing, to remind himself why he'd hired me. What he didn't know was that every line on that resume had been earned through blood, sweat, and sheer determination to prove that the woman he'd thrown away was worth more than he'd ever imagined. "Thank you," I replied, maintaining my professional demeanor. "I believe in treating every property as if it were my own, every tenant as if they were family. After all, for many people, their apartment isn't just where they live. It's their entire world, their sanctuary, their safe space." I watched his face carefully as I spoke, looking for any flicker of conscience, any recognition of the pain he'd caused over the years. But Marcus had built walls around his empathy long ago, if it had ever existed at all. He nodded absently, already moving on to the next document. "Yes, of course. Customer service is important. But let's be clear about priorities here. These properties need to generate maximum revenue. If tenants can't keep up with market rates, well," he shrugged, "there are always others willing to pay what the market demands." The casual cruelty in his voice was exactly what I remembered. The same tone he'd used when he'd told me that my military service meant nothing in the real world. That heroes didn't get special treatment when it came to rent. "Absolutely," I agreed, my smile never wavering. "Market forces are important. Though I've found that treating tenants with respect often leads to better long-term relationships, fewer vacancies, reduced turnover costs. Sometimes what seems like compassion is actually just good business." It was a test, a small probe to see if he'd learned anything over the years, if success had brought him any wisdom or humanity. The look he gave me suggested it hadn't. "Compassion doesn't pay the bills," he said with a short laugh. "In this business, you learn quickly that people will take advantage of any weakness you show. Give them an inch, they'll take a mile. I've built this company on firm boundaries and clear."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Expectations. No exceptions. No sob stories. Each word felt like a nail in a coffin. Confirmation that the man who destroyed my life hadn't changed, hadn't grown, hadn't learned. He was still the same predator who saw vulnerability as opportunity, pain as profit. I opened another folder, this one containing detailed reports on each of his properties. "Speaking of boundaries," I said, my voice taking on a slightly harder edge, "I've reviewed the maintenance records for your residential buildings. There are some concerning patterns. Delayed repairs, substandard materials, tenant complaints that seem to have been ignored." I spread photos across the table, images of water damage, broken heating systems, pest infestations, all documented with timestamps and tenant statements. Marcus barely glanced at the photos. "Maintenance costs eat into profits. We fix what's absolutely necessary, when it's absolutely necessary. These people," he waved dismissively at the photos, "they complain about everything." You give them luxury accommodations, they'll find something to whine about. His casual dismissal of human suffering was breathtaking in its callousness, and I felt the familiar fire building in my chest, the same righteous anger that had sustained me through the darkest days after my eviction. Interesting perspective, I said, keeping my voice level. Though I notice several of these complaints are about heat and hot water during winter months. Basic habitability issues that are actually legal requirements, not luxuries. I pulled out another document. There are also some questions about eviction procedures. It seems like your company has a pattern of rapid evictions, sometimes without proper notice periods. For the first time since I'd entered the room, Marcus looked genuinely irritated. His jaw tightened, and he set down his pen with more force than necessary. Ms. Rodriguez, I didn't hire you to second-guess my business practices. I hired you to implement them efficiently. If you're not comfortable with how I run my company, perhaps this isn't the right fit. The threat was clear, the same bullying tactic he'd used on countless tenants over the years. Pay up, shut up, or get out. But I wasn't the same woman he'd intimidated 23 years ago. I was someone who'd stared down enemy combatants, who'd made life-and-death decisions under fire, who'd rebuilt herself from nothing into someone who commanded respect in boardrooms across the country. His attempt at intimidation only strengthened my resolve. "Oh, I'm very comfortable with accountability," I replied, my smile turning predatory. "In fact, I insist on it. You see, Mr. Blackwood, when Apex Real Estate Solutions takes on a client, we become legally responsible for ensuring all properties meet federal, state, and local housing standards. Any violations could expose both of us to significant liability." I leaned forward slightly. "I'm simply making sure we understand the risks we're inheriting." Marcus's face was reddening now, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Listen here," he started, his voice rising, but I cut him off with a raised hand. "No, Mr. Blackwood, you listen." My voice was steel wrapped in silk, commanding and uncompromising. "I've reviewed your files, your practices, your history. I know exactly what kind of landlord you've been, what kind of man you are. The question is, are you ready to change, or are you going to continue down the same path that's left a trail of broken lives in your wake?" The mask was slipping now, just slightly, but enough for him to see that this wasn't just business for me, this was personal. He was staring at me now, really seeing me for the first time, and I watched as the pieces began to fall into place in his mind. The defiant tone, the intimate knowledge of his practices, the way I'd spoken about broken lives, as if I'd witnessed them firsthand. His face went pale as recognition finally dawned. "Elena Rodriguez," he whispered, more to himself than to me. 23 years ago, Building 47 on Maple Street, Unit 3B. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a long, extinguished fire. He remembered. After all these years, through all the tenants he'd evicted, all the lives he'd disrupted, he remembered the broken veteran he'd thrown onto the street. "Very good," I said, my voice soft but lethal. I wondered how long it would take. Though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised you remember. After all, it's not every day you get to destroy a decorated war hero's life and call it business. The pretense was gone now, the professional mask discarded. We were no longer property manager and client. We were predator and prey, and for the first time in 23 years, he wasn't the one holding all the cards. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his face cycling through emotions: surprise, fear, calculation, and finally, a return to his default arrogance. "Well, well," he said, attempting to regain his composure. "Elena Rodriguez, you've certainly done well for yourself, though I have to say, this is highly unprofessional. Using a business relationship to settle old scores?" He was trying to flip the script to make me the villain in this story, but I'd been preparing for this conversation for too long to be derailed by his manipulation. "Old scores?" I repeated, my eyebrows rising. "Is that what you call it when you illegally evict a disabled veteran 2 days before Christmas? When you ignore federal housing protections and throw someone's belongings into the snow? When you tell a woman who served her country that her sacrifice means nothing because she can't pay rent?" Each question was a surgical strike, precise and devastating. "You were behind on rent," he said defensively, but his voice lacked conviction. "I had every right." "You had no right." I cut him off, my voice sharp as a blade. I was protected under federal law as a disabled veteran. I had documented my situation, provided medical records, requested reasonable accommodations. "You violated the Service Members Civil Relief Act, the Fair Housing Act, and basic human decency." I pulled out a thick folder from my briefcase. "But we'll get to that. First, let me tell you what happened after you threw me out." The room was silent except for the sound of Marcus's labored breathing. He was trapped now, caught between his past crimes and his current vulnerability. The woman he'd once dismissed as powerless now held his entire empire in her hands, and we both knew it. I could see him calculating, trying to find an angle, a way to regain control, but for the first time in his privileged life, Marcus Blackwood was completely at someone else's mercy. "You want to know what happened to the broken veteran you discarded?" I continued, my voice steady and implacable. "She spent Christmas Eve in her car, 28 degrees below zero, with everything she owned stuffed into garbage bags. She showered at truck stops and ate $1 menu meals when she could afford them. She slept in hospital waiting rooms and applied for job after job, only to be turned away because she had no address, no clean clothes, no way to present herself as anything other than what you'd made her: homeless." Marcus was fidgeting now, his gold pen clicking against the table in a nervous rhythm. Part of me wanted to see remorse in his eyes, some indication that my suffering had meant something to him, but there was only discomfort at being confronted with the consequences of his actions. "But here's what you didn't count on," I said, leaning forward. "You thought breaking me would end my story. You thought that throwing a wounded veteran onto the street would be the final chapter. What you didn't realize is that some people, when you break them down to nothing, discover they're made of something unbreakable." I opened the folder and began laying out documents, each one a milestone in my journey from his victim to his judge. "Community college enrollment records," I said, placing the first document on the table. I started with my GED because trauma had made it impossible to focus during my final months of service. "Straight A's, Mr. Blackwood. Turns out that when you've lost everything, education becomes a lifeline." I placed another document. "Transfer to State University. Bachelor's degree in Business Administration, magna cum laude. Amazing what you can accomplish when you're motivated by the memory of someone's cruelty." Marcus was staring at the documents as if they were evidence in a trial, which, in a way, they were. This was my trial, 23 years in the making, and I was both prosecutor and judge. MBA from Harvard. I continued, adding another diploma to the growing pile. Full scholarship based on academic merit and my status as a disabled veteran, the same status you told me was worthless. I could see him processing this information, realizing that the woman he'd destroyed had not only survived but thrived, had turned his rejection into rocket fuel for her own transformation. 15 years with Morrison and Associates, I said, placing performance reviews and commendations on the table. Started as an intern, worked my way up to senior vice president. Specialized in property management and real estate law. Funny how life comes full circle, isn't it? The irony was beautiful and terrible, and I could see him beginning to understand the true scope of what was happening here. "And now," I said, pulling out the final document, "Senior Property Manager with Apex Real Estate Solutions, with full authority over client portfolios and legal compliance." I set the contract down directly in front of him. "Your signature is right there at the bottom, Mr. Blackwood. You hired me. You put me in charge of your empire. You handed me the power to destroy everything you've built, just like you destroyed everything I had." The conference room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the magnitude of his situation became clear. Marcus was no longer the predator in this scenario. He was the prey, caught in a trap of his own making, signed and sealed with his own hand. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the first genuine fear I'd seen from him. It was intoxicating, this reversal of power, but I had to remind myself that this wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. "I want you to understand something," I said, my voice calm and measured. For 23 years, I've carried the memory of what you did to me. Every night I spent in that car, every meal I skipped to save money, every time someone looked at me like I was worthless, I thought about this moment. I thought about what I would say to you, what I would do to you if I ever had the chance. Marcus was gripping the edge of the table now, his knuckles white with tension. Elena, if this is about money, this isn't about money, I cut him off. This is about accountability. This is about the fact that you've spent 30 years treating people like disposable commodities, destroying lives without consequence, hiding behind lawyers and legal technicalities while real human beings suffered. I stood up, my hands planted firmly on the table, leaning toward him. Do you have any idea how many veterans you've made homeless, how many families you've destroyed? How many children have gone to bed hungry because their parents couldn't meet your impossible standards? The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of decades of injustice. Marcus looked older suddenly, smaller, as if the gravity of his actions was finally pressing down on him. But I wasn't finished. This conversation had been building for 23 years, and I wasn't going to waste it. I spent the first year after you evicted me wanting to die, I said, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words. I had survivor's guilt from my time in service, PTSD, that the VA was barely equipped to handle. And then you stripped away the one thing I had left, my home, my dignity, my hope. I planned my suicide 3 different times, Mr. Blackwood. 3 times I was ready to end it all, because the pain of existing in the world you'd thrown me into was more than I could bear. His face was ashen now, and I could see something flickering behind his eyes. Maybe conscience, maybe just fear of liability. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was finally hearing the consequences of his actions, finally understanding that his victims were real people with real pain. But then something happened, I continued, straightening up. I realized that dying would mean you won. It would mean that your cruelty was the final word in my story. And I decided that wasn't acceptable. I decided that if I was going to survive, it wouldn't just be to spite you. It would be to surpass you, to become everything you said I could never be. I walked around the table slowly, deliberately, until I was standing behind his chair. He didn't turn around, didn't move, barely seemed to breathe. Every promotion I earned, every deal I closed, every life I helped improve through ethical property management, it was all leading to this moment. The moment when the woman you tried to erase would return to erase you. You can't do this, he said finally, his voice shaking. This is extortion. This is justice, I said, walking back to my side of the table. And it's completely legal. You hired me, Mr. Blackwood. You signed a contract giving me full authority over your properties. I'm simply going to do my job. Ensure that every single one of your buildings meets legal standards, that every tenant is treated with dignity and respect, that every violation of housing law is corrected immediately. I sat back down and opened another folder, this one thick with legal documents and inspection reports. Let me show you what that looks like in practice. Building 47 on Maple Street. Yes, the same building where you evicted me has 17 code violations. Heating system hasn't been properly maintained in 8 years, there's black mold in 6 units, and the fire escape doesn't meet current safety standards. Estimated cost of repairs, $4.2 million. Marcus was staring at the report as if it were a death sentence. $4 million? That's impossible. The building isn't worth half that. Then perhaps you should have maintained it properly over the years, I said without sympathy. But that's just the beginning. Building 23 on Oak Avenue has asbestos in the basement and lead paint in 12 units. Building 15 on Pine Street has a roof that's been leaking for 3 years, causing extensive water damage. Should I continue? I could see him doing the math in his head, calculating the cost of bringing all his properties up to legal standards. The number was staggering, possibly more than his company's liquid assets. He was trapped between bankruptcy and criminal liability, with no good options. You've been cutting corners for 30 years, I said, driving the point home. Maximizing profits while minimizing maintenance, charging premium rents for substandard housing. That might have worked when you could intimidate tenants into silence. But times have changed, I've changed. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had created his own nemesis through his cruelty. By destroying me, he'd forged the very weapon that would ultimately destroy him. Every night I'd spent homeless had hardened my resolve. Every insult I'd endured had sharpened my focus. Every obstacle I'd overcome had prepared me for this moment. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The fight had gone out of him completely. The powerful landlord who'd terrorized tenants for decades was reduced to a frightened old man, finally facing the consequences of his actions. "Now," I said, closing the folders and stacking them neatly, "you have a choice. You can work with me to bring your properties into compliance, treat your tenants with dignity, and operate your business ethically. Or you can fight me, in which case I'll personally ensure that every violation is reported to the appropriate authorities, every illegal eviction is investigated, and every tenant you've wronged has access to the best legal representation money can buy." The choice was no choice at all, and we both knew it. Marcus had spent his career exploiting the powerless, never imagining that one of his victims might someday return with the power to hold him accountable. The wheel of justice had turned slowly, but it had turned completely. As I gathered my documents and prepared to leave, I looked at Marcus one final time. He seemed to have aged years in the span of our conversation, the weight of his crimes finally settling on his shoulders. Part of me felt sorry for him, a tiny part. But mostly I felt the sweet satisfaction of justice finally served. "I'll be in touch within the week with a comprehensive improvement plan for all your properties," I said, my voice professional once again. "I suggest you start liquidating some assets. This is going to be expensive." I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and Mr. Blackwood? That broken veteran you threw onto the street 23 years ago? She wants you to know that heroes don't always win immediately. Sometimes they win eventually. And when they do, it's absolute." The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I found myself alone in the hallway, 23 years of pain and determination culminating in this single moment of triumph. The girl who'd once begged for mercy had become the woman who delivered justice. The victim had become the victor. And Marcus Blackwood, the man who'd thought he could discard people like trash, was about to learn that some garbage comes back to haunt you. As I walked through the lobby of the building that now fell under my authority, I couldn't help but smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more work to be done, more wrongs to be righted. But tonight, for the first time in 23 years, the scales were balanced. Justice had been patient, but justice had prevailed. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, I was writing the ending. The moment I stepped out of that boardroom, my legs nearly buckled beneath me. 23 years of buried trauma had just surfaced in a single conversation, and the adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was beginning to fade. I made it to the elevator before the trembling started, my hands shaking as I pressed the button for the parking garage. The reflection staring back at me in the polished steel doors showed a composed professional woman, but inside, I was still that terrified veteran clutching eviction notice in her trembling fingers. The parking garage was dimly lit and nearly empty at this hour. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive, letting the memories wash over me like a tide I'd been holding back for decades. Marcus Blackwood had no idea what his casual cruelty had set in motion that December day in 2001. He'd seen a broken veteran behind on rent and made a calculated business decision. What he hadn't seen was a woman whose entire sense of purpose had been stripped away when she'd been medically discharged from the army after taking shrapnel in her left leg during a convoy attack outside Kandahar. I was 24 years old when my military career ended, though the doctors said I was lucky to be alive. The metal fragments were too close to major arteries to remove safely, which meant chronic pain for the rest of my life. More than that, it meant the end of the only life I'd ever known. I'd enlisted straight out of high school, drawn by the promise of structure, purpose, and a chance to serve something greater than myself. The Army had given me everything: identity, family, mission. When that was taken away, I was left adrift in a civilian world I didn't understand. The transition was supposed to be temporary. I'd rented that small apartment on Maple Street with my disability compensation and the modest savings I'd managed to accumulate during 5 years of service. The plan was simple: use my GI benefits to go to college, find a career that could accommodate my physical limitations, and build a new life. But the reality of post-traumatic stress was something no one had prepared me for. The nightmares that left me afraid to sleep. The hypervigilance that made crowded places feel like combat zones. The crushing depression that made getting out of bed feel like an insurmountable challenge. By November 2001, I was falling behind on everything. Rent, bills, basic self-care, the physical therapy sessions I couldn't afford, the counseling appointments I kept missing because leaving the apartment felt impossible some days. I'd applied for jobs, but every interview was a disaster. I'd sit across from potential employers, trying to explain gaps in my resume, trying to hide the way loud noises made me flinch, trying to present myself as a stable candidate when I felt anything but stable. The first eviction notice came on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday had been supply day in Afghanistan, and the routine memory triggered a panic attack that lasted 3 hours. The notice was cold, clinical, detailing exactly how much I owed and when I had to pay or vacate. No consideration for my service record, my disability status, or the fact that my rent was only 2 weeks late due to a delay in my VA payments. I'd gone to Marcus Blackwood's office that Friday, wearing my only professional outfit and carrying a folder with my discharge papers, medical records, and documentation of my protected status under federal housing law. The secretary had made me wait for 2 hours before grudgingly allowing me 5 minutes with the great man himself. He'd been younger then, maybe mid-40s, with that same arrogant bearing but sharper edges. His office was all dark wood and leather, designed to intimidate, and it had worked. "Mr. Blackwood," I'd said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. "I'm Elena Rodriguez from Unit 3B. I received an eviction notice, but I wanted to discuss my situation with you personally." I'd placed my folder on his desk, opening it to reveal my honorable discharge certificate. "I'm a disabled veteran, and my benefits were delayed this month due to a processing error at the VA. I have the documentation here, and I'll have the rent plus late fees within 10 days. He'd barely glanced at the papers, his attention focused on something on his computer screen. "Ms. Rodriguez, is it? Let me explain something to you. I don't care if you're a veteran, a nun, or the president's daughter. Rent is due on the 1st, late fees apply after the 5th, and eviction proceedings begin after the 15th. You're at day 18. This is a business, not a charity. But federal law requires reasonable accommodations for disabled veterans," I'd said, pulling out the relevant statutes I'd researched at the public library. "The Service Members Civil Relief Act specifically protects—" "Are you a lawyer, Ms. Rodriguez?" he'd interrupted, finally looking up from his screen with cold amusement. "Because unless you have a law degree, I suggest you leave the legal interpretation to people who actually understand these things. You owe me money. Pay it or leave. Those are your options." The humiliation had been crushing, but I'd tried once more. "Sir, I served my country for 5 years. I was wounded in combat defending the freedoms that allow you to run your business. I'm not asking for charity, just for the respect and protection that federal law guarantees to veterans in my situation." His laugh had been the cruelest sound I'd ever heard. "You want respect? Respect is paying your bills on time. Respect is not making excuses when you fail to meet your obligations. Your military service doesn't entitle you to special treatment in the real world, honey. Heroes are for movies. This is reality. And in reality, you're just another tenant who can't pay her rent." I'd left his office that day with my dignity in tatters and my faith in justice shaken to its core. But I'd also left with something else, a burning determination to prove him wrong, even if I had no idea how. The eviction had proceeded exactly as he'd promised. 5 days later, sheriff's deputies had shown up at my door with court orders and moving boxes. They'd been kind but firm, giving me 30 minutes to pack what I could carry and leave the rest behind. I'd spent that Christmas Eve in my 15-year-old Honda Civic, parked behind a 24-hour diner, watching families through the frosted windows as they celebrated together. The temperature had dropped to -28 degrees, and I'd run the engine every hour to keep from freezing, burning through precious gas money just to survive the night. My leg throbbed constantly in the cold, and I'd run out of pain medication 2 days earlier because I couldn't afford the refill. The next morning, Christmas Day, I'd made a decision that would change everything. I was sitting in that diner, nursing a cup of coffee I couldn't afford, when I overheard a conversation at the next table. 2 men in expensive suits were discussing a real estate deal, talking about cash flow and profit margins and market penetration, with the casual expertise of people who understood money as a tool rather than a desperate need. One of them mentioned his MBA from Wharton, how business school had taught him to think strategically about investment opportunities. That's when it hit me. Marcus Blackwood had defeated me because he understood the game better than I did. He had weapons, legal knowledge, financial resources, social connections that I didn't even know existed. But those weapons weren't inherited or innate. They were learned skills, and anything that could be learned could be mastered by someone with sufficient motivation. I had something most people didn't, a combat veteran's understanding of what it meant to be truly motivated. The path forward crystallized in my mind with tactical clarity. I would learn his game, master his weapons, and then return to settle the score on equal terms. But first, I had to survive. I spent the next 6 months living in my car, showering at truck stops and YMCAs, eating day-old donuts from bakeries that were throwing them away anyway. I found work where I could, cleaning office buildings at night, stocking shelves at grocery stores, anything that paid cash and didn't require a permanent address. The turning point came in June 2002, when I walked into the community college admissions office and declared my intention to enroll. The counselor, a kind woman named Patricia Chen, took one look at my situation and connected me with every resource available. Emergency housing assistance, food stamps, work-study programs, academic support for veterans with PTSD. For the first time since my discharge, someone was treating my veteran status as an asset rather than an excuse. That first semester was brutal. I was taking remedial math and English because my service years had left gaps in my formal education, working 20 hours a week at a campus job, and dealing with panic attacks that would hit without warning during crowded lectures. But I'd found something I'd lost since leaving the Army: a mission. Every assignment was reconnaissance. Every test was a battle. Every semester was a campaign in a larger war. One was determined to win. The nightmares didn't stop, but they changed. Instead of reliving the convoy attack, I started dreaming about boardrooms and contracts, about standing across from Marcus Blackwood as an equal rather than a supplicant. I'd wake up with my heart racing, but instead of despair, I felt anticipation. Somewhere in those dreams, the broken veteran was transforming into something harder, smarter, more dangerous. My professors noticed the intensity I brought to every class. Dr. Williams, who taught business ethics, pulled me aside after a particularly heated discussion about corporate responsibility to vulnerable populations. "Elena," he had said, "you argue these points like your life depends on them. What's driving this passion?" I'd given him a sanitized version of my story, but he'd understood enough to recommend me for accelerated programs and academic scholarships. By my second year, I was taking 18 credit hours per semester while working part-time at a property management company. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was learning the landlord business from the ground up, understanding every aspect of tenant relations, lease agreements, and housing law. My supervisor, an older man named Tom Bradley who'd served in Vietnam, recognized something familiar in my drive and took me under his wing. "You remind me of myself when I got back from Southeast Asia," he told me one evening as we finished inspecting a problematic building. "Angry at the world, determined to prove something to everyone who'd written you off. Channel that energy right, and you'll go places most people can only dream of. Channel it wrong, and it'll eat you alive." Tom became my first real mentor in the civilian world, teaching me not just the technical aspects of property management, but the psychology behind it. "Real estate is about people," he'd explain as we walked through apartment buildings, noting maintenance issues and tenant concerns. "The money, the contracts, the legal stuff, that's all just paperwork. But understanding what motivates people, what they fear, what they need to feel secure, that's where you gain real power." He taught me to see properties through a tenant's eyes, to understand that for most people, their apartment represented far more than just shelter. It was stability, security, identity. A good property manager didn't just maintain buildings, they maintained people's sense of home. It was a lesson that Marcus Blackwood had never learned, viewing tenants as income sources rather than human beings with legitimate needs and rights. Under Tom's guidance, I discovered I had a natural talent for the work. I could walk through a building and immediately identify problems that other managers missed. More importantly, I could talk to tenants in a way that made them feel heard and respected. Word spread quickly through the company that Elena Rodriguez was someone who got results without creating drama or conflict. The academic side was progressing just as well. I'd found my rhythm in college, learning to manage my PTSD symptoms while excelling in business courses that came to me with surprising ease. Economics, finance, marketing, management theory, concepts that had seemed impossibly abstract suddenly made perfect sense when I understood they were tools for achieving specific objectives. During my junior year, I started working on an independent research project about predatory landlord practices and their impact on veteran homelessness. The statistics were staggering. Veterans were 50% more likely to face eviction than civilians, often due to untreated mental health issues, delayed benefit payments, or unscrupulous landlords who targeted vulnerable populations. My professor, Dr. Sarah Martinez, encouraged me to present my findings at a national conference on housing policy. Standing at that podium, addressing an audience of academics, policymakers, and housing advocates, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just personal anymore. My experience with Marcus Blackwood represented a systemic problem that was destroying lives across the country. If I could find a way to hold people like him accountable, I wouldn't just be settling a personal score. I'd be fighting for every veteran who'd been thrown away by a system that should have protected them. The presentation led to opportunities I'd never imagined. Dr. Martinez connected me with housing rights organizations, legal aid societies, and advocacy groups focused on veteran issues. I started volunteering with a nonprofit that provided legal assistance to veterans facing eviction, using my growing expertise in housing law to help people navigate the same system that had once destroyed me. That's where I met Jennifer Walsh, a staff attorney who would become both a close friend and a crucial ally in my long-term strategy. Jennifer had been fighting predatory landlords for 15 years, and she recognized something in my case that I hadn't fully understood myself. Elena, she'd said over coffee after I'd told her about my eviction, what Marcus Blackwood did to you wasn't just cruel, it was illegal. Federal law clearly protects disabled veterans from exactly this kind of discrimination. The fact that you documented everything, requested accommodations in writing, and were ignored completely, that's a slam-dunk civil rights violation. The possibility of legal action had occurred to me, but I'd always assumed the statute of limitations had passed. Jennifer explained that certain civil rights violations had longer limitation periods, especially when they involved patterns of discriminatory behavior. More importantly, she suggested that taking on Marcus Blackwood could establish precedents that would protect other veterans in similar situations. But here's the thing, she'd continued, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who understood the stakes. To win a case like this, you need more than just evidence of discrimination. You need credibility, resources, and the kind of professional standing that makes judges and juries take you seriously. A homeless veteran telling her story gets sympathy. A successful businesswoman with an MBA and a track record of ethical property management telling the same story gets justice. That conversation crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't articulated. My transformation wasn't just about personal success. It was about acquiring the tools necessary to fight Marcus Blackwood on equal terms. Every degree, every promotion, every professional achievement was a weapon in a war I'd been fighting since that humiliating day in his office. I graduated summa cum laude with my bachelor's degree in May 2006, exactly 5 years after my eviction. Tom Bradley and my entire team from the property management company attended the ceremony, cheering as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma. Sitting in the audience, watching this small victory in a much larger campaign, I thought about the woman who'd begged Marcus Blackwood for mercy and felt a fierce pride in how far she'd traveled. But undergraduate success was just the beginning. Jennifer had been right about needing credentials that commanded respect, and that meant business school. I'd been accepted to several MBA programs, but Harvard represented something special, The kind of institutional prestige that opened doors and ended arguments before they started. More importantly, Harvard's business school had a strong focus on ethical leadership and corporate responsibility, exactly the framework I needed to understand how to build power and use it justly. The transition from community college to Harvard was jarring in ways I hadn't anticipated. My classmates came from privilege I could barely comprehend. Prep schools and family businesses, summer homes and European vacations, casual conversations about trust funds and family connections. I felt like an anthropologist studying an alien culture, learning their language and customs while never forgetting that I was fundamentally different from them. But I also discovered advantages that my background provided. While my classmates approached business problems as academic exercises, I understood them as life and death decisions that affected real people in profound ways. When we studied case studies about housing markets or employment practices, I could contribute perspectives that came from lived experience, rather than theoretical knowledge. Professor Robert Chen, who taught a course on business ethics and social responsibility, became particularly interested in my insights about how corporate decisions affected vulnerable populations. He encouraged me to focus my coursework on real estate law and property management, seeing it as an underexplored area where business school graduates could make significant social impact. "Elena," he'd said during office hours one afternoon, "you have a unique combination of technical knowledge and moral clarity that's rare in this field. Most of my students understand profit maximization but struggle with the human cost of their decisions. You understand both sides of that equation, which gives you the potential to revolutionize how this industry operates." His words carried more weight than he realized. I wasn't just studying property management as an academic subject. I was developing the expertise necessary to eventually take control of Marcus Blackwood's empire and transform it into something that actually served its tenants, rather than exploiting them. Every case study about ethical business practices, every seminar on leadership and corporate governance, was preparation for a confrontation that was still years in the future, but always at the center of my planning. The real breakthrough came during my second year, when I was selected for a summer internship with Morrison & Associates, one of the most prestigious property management firms on the East Coast. The company managed billions of dollars in real estate assets, from luxury residential buildings to massive commercial developments. More importantly, they had a reputation for ethical business practices and innovative approaches to tenant relations. My supervisor, Catherine Morrison herself, was a Harvard MBA who'd built the company from nothing into an industry leader through a combination of strategic thinking and genuine concern for the people affected by her business decisions. She became my second crucial mentor, teaching me how to scale ethical practices across large organizations and how to use market forces to reward good behavior rather than punish it. "The secret to our success," Catherine explained during one of our weekly mentoring sessions, "is understanding that tenant satisfaction and profit maximization aren't opposing goals. They're complementary strategies. Happy tenants stay longer, take better care of their units, refer friends and family, and generate positive word of mouth that reduces marketing costs. Treating people well isn't just morally right, it's good business." Under her guidance, I learned to see the property management industry from a completely different perspective. Instead of viewing tenants as adversaries to be controlled and exploited, Catherine's approach treated them as customers whose needs should be understood and satisfied. It was a radical departure from the Marcus Blackwood model, and it was incredibly effective. The internship led to a full-time offer upon graduation, starting as a junior associate with a clear path toward partnership. I accepted immediately, understanding that Morrison & Associates would provide the perfect training ground for eventually taking on someone like Marcus Blackwood. I would learn to manage large portfolios, deal with complex legal issues, and build the kind of professional network that could support major initiatives. More importantly, working for Catherine Morrison gave me access to resources that individual operators like Marcus Blackwood couldn't match. The company had entire departments dedicated to legal compliance, tenant relations, and property maintenance. They employed teams of lawyers, accountants, and specialists who ensured that every building met not just minimum legal standards, but best practices for habitability and tenant satisfaction. It was during my third year with Morrison & Associates that I first began serious reconnaissance on Marcus Blackwood's operations. Using the company's research resources and my growing network of industry contacts, I started building a comprehensive profile of his business practices, financial situation, and legal vulnerabilities. What I discovered was even worse than I'd imagined. Marcus Blackwood's company was a textbook example of predatory landlord practices. He systematically targeted vulnerable populations: veterans, immigrants, single mothers, elderly people on fixed incomes, because they were less likely to know their rights or have resources to fight back. His buildings were consistently cited for code violations, but he'd learned to game the system, paying minimal fines rather than making expensive repairs. Most damning of all, I discovered that my eviction wasn't an isolated incident. Through public records searches and conversations with tenant advocacy groups, I found dozens of similar cases where Marcus had illegally evicted protected tenants, ignored federal housing laws, and used intimidation tactics to silence complaints. The pattern was clear, consistent, and thoroughly documented, exactly what Jennifer Walsh had said would be necessary to build a comprehensive case against him. But I also discovered something else. Marcus Blackwood's empire was built on a foundation of debt and creative financing that left him vulnerable to exactly the kind of ethical property management takeover I was envisioning. His buildings were poorly maintained because he was leveraged to the hilt, using rental income to service massive loans rather than invest in proper upkeep. Any significant expense, like bringing his properties up to legal standards, would create a cash flow crisis that could force him into bankruptcy. The more I learned about his operation, the more I understood that Marcus Blackwood was fundamentally a parasite, extracting value from properties and communities without contributing anything positive in return. He'd built his wealth by externalizing costs onto tenants and taxpayers, leaving behind a trail of substandard housing, displaced families, and degraded neighborhoods. Armed with this knowledge, I began developing what I privately called the plan, a comprehensive strategy for eventually taking control of Marcus Blackwood's portfolio and transforming it into a model of ethical property management. The plan had 3 phases. First, establish myself as a recognized expert in ethical property management with the resources to take on major rehabilitation projects. Second, position myself to acquire operational control of his portfolio when his financial vulnerabilities finally caught up with him. And third, use that platform to demonstrate that treating tenants with dignity and respect wasn't just morally superior, but financially sustainable. The timeline was necessarily long-term. I would need years to build the reputation, resources, and professional network necessary to execute such an ambitious plan. But I'd learned patience in the Army, and I'd learned strategic thinking at Harvard. More importantly, I'd learned that justice delayed wasn't always justice denied. Sometimes it was justice perfected. By my 5th year with Morrison & Associates, I'd been promoted to senior vice president with responsibility for the company's largest residential portfolios. I was managing billions of dollars in assets, overseeing thousands of housing units, and directly improving the lives of tens of thousands of tenants. The work was deeply satisfying, but it was also preparation for something bigger. Catherine Morrison had begun talking about succession planning, hinting that I was being considered for eventual partnership and possibly even leadership of the company. It was everything I'd worked toward professionally, the culmination of my transformation from homeless veteran to industry leader. But I knew my ultimate destination lay elsewhere. In quiet moments, usually late at night in my downtown apartment that overlooked the city where Marcus Blackwood still operated with impunity, I would think about that terrified young woman who'd begged for mercy in his office 20 years earlier. She'd been powerless, desperate, easily dismissed and forgotten. The woman she'd become was none of those things. I was ready for the final phase of the plan. It was time to come home. The week following my confrontation with Marcus Blackwood passed in a blur of activity that would have been impossible without the groundwork I'd laid over the previous 2 decades. Within 48 hours of our meeting, I had teams of inspectors, contractors, and legal experts descending on every property in his portfolio like a highly coordinated military operation. The difference was that this time, instead of destroying targets, we were there to rebuild them. Marcus had tried calling me 6 times the first day, his messages growing increasingly desperate as the reality of his situation sank in. I didn't return any of them. There was nothing left to discuss between us personally. Everything now would be handled through official channels, documented communications, and legal processes that he couldn't manipulate or intimidate his way out of. The first property I chose to inspect personally was, of course, Building 47 on Maple Street. Standing in front of the same brick facade where I'd been evicted 23 years earlier felt surreal, like stepping into a recurring nightmare that had finally become lucid. The building looked tired, neglected, its red brick faded to a dull brown and the front steps cracked from years of deferred maintenance. This was where my transformation had begun, and it felt appropriate that it would be where Marcus Blackwood's reign of negligence would end. Mrs. Chen answered the door of Unit 2A, with the cautious wariness I recognized from my own time as one of Marcus's tenants. She was elderly, maybe 75, and her apartment was sweltering despite the October chill outside. The heating system I'd flagged in my report wasn't just inadequate, it was completely broken, forcing tenants to rely on dangerous space heaters that drove up their electric bills while providing minimal warmth. "Are you here about the heat?" she asked hopefully. Then her expression fell as she took in my professional attire. "Or are you here about the rent increase?" The defeat in her voice was heartbreaking and familiar. How many conversations like this had Marcus had with vulnerable tenants over the years, using their desperation as leverage to extract compliance with increasingly unreasonable demands? "Neither," I said gently. "I'm Elena Rodriguez, the new property manager. I'm here to fix the heat, along with everything else that's been broken in this building for too long." The relief that flooded her face was immediate and profound, and I realized that for many of Marcus's tenants, the idea of someone actually caring about their living conditions was so foreign it seemed impossible. Mrs. Chen invited me in for tea, and over the next hour I heard a story that could have been my own. She was a widow living on Social Security, afraid to complain about conditions because she couldn't afford to move and had nowhere else to go. The rent increases came regularly, but the promised improvements never materialized. When her refrigerator died last winter, she'd spent 3 months eating canned food and peanut butter sandwiches, because Marcus claimed appliance replacement wasn't his responsibility. "He told me I should be grateful to have a roof over my head at all," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea into chipped cups. "Said there were plenty of people who would take my place if I didn't like the arrangements." It was the same script Marcus had used on me, the same calculated cruelty designed to make vulnerable people feel powerless and grateful for their own exploitation. I spent the rest of that afternoon going door to door through Building 47, listening to similar stories from every tenant I met. Carlos Morales in 3A was a day laborer whose broken bathroom ceiling had been temporarily patched with plastic sheeting for 8 months. Sarah Williams in 1B was a single mother whose daughter had developed asthma, possibly from the black mold growing behind the kitchen cabinets that Marcus refused to properly remediate. Each story added another layer to my understanding of the systematic negligence that had defined his business model. But the most powerful moment came when I knocked on the door of Unit 3B, my old apartment. The young woman who answered could have been me 23 years earlier, military-bearing despite civilian clothes, the particular type of alertness that comes from combat experience, and an underlying exhaustion that spoke to struggles beyond what was visible on the surface. Jessica Torres. She introduced herself, and I noticed the slight tremor in her left hand that suggested traumatic brain injury. "Are you here about the lease renewal? Because I can probably come up with the deposit increase if you give me another week." The defensive hopefulness in her voice was exactly what I'd sounded like when I'd begged Marcus for more time. "Actually," I said, "I'm here to tell you that there won't be any deposit increase. In fact, your rent is being reduced to reflect the actual value of this unit in its current condition, and we'll be making extensive improvements over the next few months." Her confusion was so complete that I had to repeat myself twice before she understood what I was saying. Jessica invited me in, and I found myself standing in the same living room where I'd spent so many sleepless nights 23 years earlier. The layout was identical, but everything else showed the same systematic neglect I'd seen throughout the building. The windows were painted shut, the electrical outlets were loose and potentially dangerous, and there was a persistent, musty smell that suggested water damage behind the walls. "How long have you been here?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. 6 months, she said. "I got out of the army in April, and this was the only place I could afford on my disability payments. It's not great, but it's better than some places I've been." The resignation in her voice was heartbreaking, and I realized she was settling for conditions that no one should have to accept because she'd been conditioned to believe she didn't deserve better. That's when I made a decision that wasn't part of my original plan. "Jessica," I said, "I want you to know that what you experienced in service matters. Your sacrifice matters, and you deserve to live somewhere that reflects that respect, not somewhere that treats you like a burden." I pulled out one of my business cards and wrote my personal cell phone number on the back. "If you have any problems, and I mean any problems, with this building, with maintenance, with anything at all, you call me directly." The transformation in her expression was immediate and profound. For the first time since I'd met her, Jessica stood straighter, and I could see the soldier she'd been before civilian life had worn her down. "Thank you," she said, and those two words carried more weight than any professional recognition I'd ever received. Walking out of Building 47 that day, I felt the same sense of completion that had followed successful missions in Afghanistan. But this was different. Instead of neutralizing a threat, I'd identified an opportunity to heal wounds that had been festering for decades. Marcus Blackwood's empire wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was a network of people who'd been systematically devalued and exploited. Transforming those properties meant transforming lives. The legal process moved faster than even I had anticipated. Jennifer Walsh had been right about the strength of the civil rights case against Marcus, and when combined with the documented code violations and pattern of discriminatory practices, it created a perfect storm of legal liability that he couldn't navigate alone. His usual tactics, intimidation, delay, technical objections, were useless against a legal team that understood both the law and his methods better than he did. The breakthrough came when we discovered that Marcus had been systematically underreporting rental income to avoid property taxes, while simultaneously claiming higher income figures on loan applications to secure better financing terms. The fraud was extensive, well-documented, and precisely the kind of financial crime that prosecutors loved because it was easy to explain to juries and impossible to defend against. Within 2 weeks of that discovery, Marcus was facing criminal charges, civil rights violations, tax evasion allegations, and a class action lawsuit from tenants spanning 15 years of illegal practices. His legal bills alone were consuming more cash than his properties generated, and the court-ordered escrow accounts for repair funds had frozen his access to rental income until all code violations were remediated. The phone call came on a Thursday evening as I was reviewing contractor bids for the heating system replacement in Building 47. Marcus's voice was barely recognizable, the arrogant confidence replaced by exhaustion and desperation that I remembered feeling in my own darkest moments. "Elena," he said, and the fact that he was using my first name told me everything I needed to know about how completely his situation had deteriorated. "We need to talk, not as adversaries, but as reasonable people who can find a mutually beneficial solution to this situation." I let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. "Mr. Blackwood, all communication regarding your portfolio should go through official channels. If you have a business proposal, your attorney can submit it to my legal team for review." "Please," he said, and the word came out cracked and raw. "Just give me 5 minutes. Face to face. You've made your point. I understand that. Now, but destroying my company doesn't help anyone, including your tenants. Let me make this right." The old Elena might have felt sympathy for that broken tone, might have been moved by the apparent humility. But 23 years had taught me to recognize desperation disguised as contrition, and I knew that Marcus was asking for mercy he'd never shown to anyone else. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, my voice steady and implacable, "you had every opportunity to make things right over the past 30 years. You chose profit over people, exploitation over ethics, cruelty over compassion. The consequences you're facing now aren't my doing. They're the natural result of your own choices. But the tenants," he pressed, "they'll suffer if the buildings go into bankruptcy. Property values in those neighborhoods will collapse. You'll hurt the very people you're trying to help." It was a clever argument, appealing to my sense of responsibility while conveniently ignoring his own role in creating the crisis. "The tenants are already suffering," I replied. "They've been suffering for decades while you extracted wealth from their desperation. At least now their suffering will end." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed again, the desperation replaced by something harder and more familiar. "You think you've won," he said, "but you have no idea what you're dealing with. I've been in this business for 30 years. I have connections, resources, political influence that you can't imagine. This isn't over." There it was, the real Marcus Blackwood, the one I remembered from that humiliating day in his office. The mask of contrition had lasted all of 3 minutes before his true nature reasserted itself. It was almost a relief to hear the threats, because it confirmed that my assessment of his character had been accurate all along. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, "you're absolutely right. You do have connections and influence that I can't imagine. Unfortunately for you, I have something you've never encountered before: the complete moral and legal authority to dismantle everything you've built. Your connections won't help you when federal prosecutors are involved. Your political influence won't matter when housing advocacy groups are documenting your crimes. And your resources won't save you when every tenant you've exploited has access to the best legal representation money can buy." I paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "You asked if this was over. It's not. But your part in it is." The line went dead, and I realized I was smiling for the first time in weeks. The conversation had confirmed what I'd suspected. Marcus Blackwood was fundamentally incapable of change, incapable of genuine remorse, incapable of anything beyond self-preservation. Any mercy I might have shown would have been wasted on someone who viewed compassion as weakness to be exploited. The final phase of my plan unfolded with the precision of a military campaign. Apex Real Estate Solutions had anticipated this outcome from the beginning, and our takeover of Marcus's portfolio was seamless and immediate. Within 30 days, we had assumed operational control of all 47 residential properties, 12 commercial buildings, and 3 mixed-use developments. The transformation was swift and dramatic. Emergency repairs were completed within the first week. Heating systems restored, electrical hazards eliminated, water damage remediated. The second wave focused on habitability improvements: fresh paint, new appliances, updated fixtures, pest control, and deep cleaning of common areas. The third wave addressed long-term infrastructure: roof repairs, foundation work, updated plumbing and electrical systems, and energy efficiency improvements that would reduce utility costs for tenants. But the most important changes weren't visible in the buildings themselves. We implemented new tenant relations policies that treated residents as valued customers, rather than adversaries. Rent increases were tied to actual improvements, rather than arbitrary market manipulation. Maintenance requests were handled within 24 hours instead of being ignored for months. Most importantly, we hired community liaisons for each building, residents who understood their neighbors' needs and could advocate for them directly with management. The financial results were exactly what Catherine Morrison had predicted years earlier. Despite the massive upfront investment in repairs and improvements, occupancy rates increased dramatically as word spread through the community that these properties were now safe, clean, and professionally managed. Tenant turnover dropped to almost zero, eliminating the constant costs of advertising, screening, and preparing units for new residents. Even with lower rents that reflected actual value rather than predatory pricing, the properties became significantly more profitable within 6 months. More importantly, the social impact was transformative. Mrs. Chen from Building 47 became the unofficial grandmother figure for her floor, organizing potluck dinners and helping newer tenants navigate city services. Carlos Morales started a tenant association that worked with management to identify problems before they became emergencies. Sarah Williams' daughter's asthma improved dramatically once the mold was professionally removed, and Sarah herself enrolled in community college classes now that she wasn't spending every evening dealing with apartment crises. Jessica Torres, the veteran in my old Unit 3B, became something like a success story that I checked on personally every few weeks. With stable housing and responsive management, she was able to focus on her recovery and career development. She'd enrolled in a computer programming boot camp specifically designed for veterans, and her confidence grew visibly each time I saw her. More than once, she thanked me for showing her that she deserved better, not just in housing but in every aspect of her life. The ripple effects extended far beyond the properties themselves. Other landlords in the area, seeing the success of our ethical management approach, began upgrading their own practices to compete for quality tenants. Neighborhood property values increased as buildings were properly maintained and communities became more stable. Local businesses thrived as residents had more disposable income to spend on things other than space heaters and emergency repairs. Marcus Blackwood's legal troubles continued to mount throughout this period. The criminal charges resulted in a plea agreement that included substantial fines, community service, and permanent prohibition from operating rental properties. The civil rights lawsuit was settled for an amount that remained confidential, but was large enough to fund a scholarship program for homeless veterans pursuing higher education. The class action suit by tenants resulted in additional compensation and a mandate for ongoing monitoring of his compliance with housing laws. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was how completely irrelevant he became to the story. The properties that had once been synonymous with his name were now known for their quality and tenant satisfaction. The communities he'd exploited for decades were healing and thriving. The vulnerable populations he'd targeted now had advocates and protections that made predatory practices impossible to sustain. I attended his sentencing hearing on a cold February morning, sitting in the back of the courtroom as he stood before the judge to receive his punishment. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the consequences of choices he'd thought would never catch up with him. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Marcus gave a brief statement about accepting responsibility and wanting to make amends. But I noticed he never once looked toward the section where his former tenants sat, never acknowledged the specific people his actions had harmed, never showed any understanding of the human cost of his business practices. Even in defeat, even facing imprisonment, he remained fundamentally unable to see his victims as anything more than abstract casualties of his success. Walking out of that courtroom, I thought about the journey that had brought me from desperate veteran to victorious advocate. 23 years had passed between Marcus throwing me onto the street and watching him led away in handcuffs. But the arc of justice had finally completed its long trajectory. The woman he'd tried to destroy had become the instrument of his destruction, and the empire he'd built on cruelty was now a model of ethical business practices. But more than personal vindication, the experience had taught me something profound about the nature of true power. Marcus had confused dominance with strength, exploitation with success, fear with respect. Real power, the kind that created lasting change and meaningful impact, came from using whatever advantages you possessed to lift others up rather than tear them down. 3 months after Marcus's sentencing, I received a letter that made everything worthwhile. It was from Jessica Torres, written on letterhead from the tech company where she'd just accepted her first programming position. The note was brief but powerful. "Elena, I wanted you to know that I just signed a lease on my first real apartment, not just a place to survive, but a home I chose because I wanted to live there. You didn't just fix my building, you fixed my understanding of what I deserve. Thank you for showing me that heroes don't always win immediately, but when they do, it changes everything." I framed that letter and hung it on the wall of my office, next to my military service medals and my Harvard diploma. It represented something more valuable than any professional achievement. Proof that justice, however delayed, however difficult, was always worth pursuing. The broken veteran who'd begged Marcus Blackwood for mercy had become someone who ensured that no one else would ever have to beg him for anything again. The story could have ended there, with justice served and lessons learned. But real transformation is never a single event. It's an ongoing process that creates new possibilities and opportunities. Within a year of taking over Marcus's portfolio, Apex Real Estate Solutions had become a model for ethical property management that was being studied and replicated across the country. Housing advocacy groups used our practices as templates for policy recommendations. Business schools developed case studies around our approach to socially responsible real estate investment. Most importantly, the success of our model attracted other investors who wanted to prove that doing good and doing well weren't mutually exclusive goals. We began acquiring properties from other predatory landlords, systematically transforming neighborhoods that had been written off as hopeless into thriving communities where people could build stable, dignified lives. As I sat in my office that evening, reviewing expansion plans that would bring ethical property management to 5 new cities over the next 3 years, I realized that Marcus Blackwood had unknowingly given me the greatest gift possible. By breaking me down so completely, he'd forced me to rebuild myself stronger, smarter, and more determined than I'd ever been. His cruelty had created his own nemesis, but more than that, it had created a force for positive change that would outlast both of us. The homeless veteran sleeping in her car on Christmas Eve could never have imagined the woman she would become. But she'd carried within herself the seeds of that transformation, waiting for the right combination of opportunity, preparation, and sheer determination to bloom. Justice had been patient, but it had never been absent. And when it finally arrived, it didn't just settle old scores. It created new possibilities for everyone who'd been told they didn't matter. That night, I drove past Building 47 on Maple Street and saw warm light glowing from every window, including the one where Jessica Torres was probably studying for her next certification exam. The building that had once represented the worst moment of my life had become a symbol of hope, renewal, and the possibility that broken things could be not just repaired but transformed into something better than they'd ever been before. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishment or revenge. Sometimes it's about taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and turning it into the best thing that ever happened to someone else. Marcus Blackwood had taught me that power without compassion was ultimately destructive. My response had been to demonstrate that compassion with power was ultimately unstoppable. The girl who'd once been thrown away like garbage had grown up to become someone who made sure no one else would ever be discarded again. And that, more than any personal victory or professional achievement, was the real measure of justice served. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.